Hello there, I'm Brian Taylor. Very warm welcome to the latest edition of my Herald podcast. Incidentally, this is the last show this year, but fret not. We'll be back better and bolder and cheekier than ever in the new year. I promise that. But to our tale, I intend to focus primarily, indeed almost predominantly, on the Scottish budget today, set out by the Finance Secretary at Holyrood yesterday. All the details on health spending, on taxation, on an attempt to green our economy still further, to tackle climate change. I'm going to discuss all of those things with my panel. Delighted to welcome them. Delighted to be joined by Fiona Hislop from the SNP, by Jamie Halcrow-Johnson from the Conservatives, by Pam Duncan-Glancy from the Labour Party, and by John Ferry from the Liberal Democrats. Welcome all. Thanks very much indeed. Let's go with taxation first. Turning it around a little bit rather than spending. Let's go with tax first. Income tax and council tax. Fiona Hislop, welcome to you. The Finance Secretary saying that income tax rates unchanged, but on the bands, she's increasing the lower level bands in line with inflation, but freezing the upper rate bands. That means, does it not, that the overall tax burden upon Scotland will be increased because of inflation working its way through?
So it's important that we support the poorest in our society, and that's what the budget has done in a whole variety of areas, not least the doubling of the child payment. So you have to take it in context about what we're trying to do in that stability. I think there is something around ensuring that all of Scotland, if you take it as a whole, in terms of paying tax, there'll be a lesser tax burden in Scotland and income tax as a whole compared to the rest of the United Kingdom. But if you do believe in redistribution to some extent, and those that are earning would be higher amounts are in a better position to meet that. Now, I know there's inflation, I know there's going to be pressure on energy costs, etc. But it is the poorest in our society that need the support the most. And I think in terms of what she's doing, it's progressive, but it's not punitive. And I think that's the point.
Elsewhere in the budget, she was talking about encouraging enterprise. The medium-term financial strategy talked about balancing encouraging enterprise with encouraging well-being, encouraging the environment. But if you're encouraging enterprise, you've set up a business in Scotland, and you're actually going to pay more tax than you would do if you're earning, 40,
well,
50,
if you set up a business in Scotland, you've still got the small business bonus if your rateable value is under 15,000. So again, no rates for that. For the next 5 months, from December, January, February, March, April, you're paying no rates if you're in retail, hospitality, etc. So in terms of that business...
You're a skilled financier working for a large bank or a large insurance company, you'd be better off in England.
Well, I think in terms of the benefits of living in Scotland, if you live in Scotland and you're a wealthy financier, your children will go to university without paying tuition fees. Your family won't have to pay prescription charges. Your elderly relatives will have free personal care. So I think in terms of the value to the public purse and indeed the value to the individual taxpayer, if you add up all the additional benefits, actually the quality of life, the value system, and the fact that we don't have a system of government in Westminster that has no values and is leading us in completely the wrong tack in terms of their morals, let alone anything else. So I think you actually judge a country not just on the pounds and pence in your pocket, it's the benefits you get, but also to live in a country that I think has a certain level of decency about it.
Let's bring in Jamie Halcrow-Johnson. What about that? It's about benefiting the poor in a more proportionate fashion. It's about progressive taxation. Do you accept that? Your party in the past has gone on about Scotland being the highest tax part of the UK. What about Fiona Hislop's argument that there are other benefits that accrue?
Well, those were very great words from Fiona, but what they didn't say was that it's not just financiers, it's not just the better off. It's more nurses, it's more doctors, it's more teachers, it's more public sector workers who will be included because of the freeze on the higher rate. So we're going to see a lot of people that people wouldn't consider the richest in society. You're going to be seeing people on, fair salaries doing vitally important jobs being taxed more because of that. And of course, the council tax issue.
For a salary, surely it's above about 45 grand. That's not a bad salary, is it, to say the least?
Well, it's not a bad salary, but it depends what people's, as you rightly pointed out, that the cost of living is going up. The point is this, that they are going to be paying more tax. And of course, that's only on the income tax side. There's also the council tax side. What we've seen is a cut to council budgets, more pressure put on those. We've seen the freeze on council tax rises taken away. This is sleight of hand by Kate Forbes and the SNP. What you're going to see is council tax bills increase. And in the front of the Herald this morning, that point was very much made. Council tax bills are likely to increase. So what we're going to see is people being hit by increasing council tax, increasing income tax for many, a cost of living increases and a huge amount of pressure. And that puts real pressure on household incomes.
Let's bring in Pam Duncan-Glancy. Pam, presumably you welcome the protection for those on lower pay. But what about this argument about the balance of taxation? Jamie rightly bringing up the council tax, the freeze has been lifted. I mean, councils may feel under some duress given that they face elections next year, but nevertheless, they are free to increase council tax. What's your take on the balance of taxation?
I think if any government is serious about making sure that we protect the poorest in society, they would have overhauled the council tax system like they said they'd do about 14 years ago. And to be honest with you, to leave that to any to councils to do and to use the most regressive taxation system in Scotland to do that is not only unfair but flies in the face of any suggestion that this government that this budget by this government is about reducing poverty. And I'd also like to just come back to the point as well about the Scottish Child Payment. We were calling for the Scottish Child Payment to be doubled immediately some time ago, and the government didn't do it. What they've said now is that they'll double it in April, and of course that's welcome. But in actual fact, if we look at if you get under the skin of what that means, 260,000 children are living in poverty today in Scotland. Only 77% of those eligible to access the Scottish Child Payment actually get it because of the lack of promotion of it and no automation in the system, and a system that could in fact be automated.
Yeah, and but hold on a second. The Finance Secretary was challenged about that yesterday. She said there would be a promotional scheme to encourage uptake. She was also challenged by Daniel Johnson about the business of the £20 child payment, and she said, okay, you demand that we put it up to 20 quid. We put it up to 20 quid, and now you say it's not enough. She says you're always trying to push ahead of and that's basically the nature of being in opposition.
Well, I actually thought that was quite disingenuous, because as soon as we had suggested that the £20 be doubled immediately, we were working with poverty organisations to say, will this do it? And actually we had a round table to look at child poverty, and we were told, no, it won't do it. And at that point we said, okay, then it needs to be doubled again in order to meet the target. So we didn't do it on the basis of what the government did or didn't. We're not going to hang around and wait for them to do something, because we've waited far too long. So we didn't, in fact, just say we'll double it again on the basis that they'd said it. They've taken far too long to do this, and it will not meet the poverty targets.
John Ferry, the Liberal Democrats made a substantial point about the business of support for local authorities, saying that the money that is going to local authorities is too tight.
Yeah, so that's absolutely right. Let me just make one point on the tax bands first.
Yeah, please.
I think it's really important when it comes to that income tax issue to actually fully understand what it means. And it's not the case that the inflation proofing of the lower tax bands is giving people an income rise of 3.1%, things like that. It's 3.1% above the personal allowance. So it's a 3.1% above that, which means that, according to the Fraser of Islander Institute, who did some analysis on this last night, they reckon that if you're earning under £25,000 a year, this income tax change that Kate Forbes talked a lot about yesterday will give you a benefit of just under £1 per year. And if you're earning over £25,000, this income tax change that Kate Forbes talked a lot about yesterday will give you a benefit of just under £5 per year. So according to the FAI, this is just a gimmick, and I think they're right. I think it's about giving it a nice press release. It's been led by the PR rather than anything substantive about changing people's standards of living.
Let's put
and
that
just to reinforce,
please finish your point, and then I'll put that to your name.
And just to reinforce some of the things that Jamie and Pam said, if this budget taken as a whole, if you're, say, a band 4 nurse with a few years' experience, you're earning just over £25,000 a year, you're going to see a real time cut to your wages because you're not falling into that position where, as a public sector worker, your wage is inflation protected. You're also almost certainly going to see a big increase in your council tax because of the way the council tax changes have gone through in this
That's up
budget.
to the local authorities to stand on a platform. It's up to them. That's
Yeah, I think it's incredibly cynical. Come back to your original question. It's incredibly cynical by the SNP administration to give this maximum flexibility to councils on a single tax lever when they've never been prepared to devolve any other flexibilities or tax raising powers to local authorities, but at the same time cutting their budgets by almost £350 million in a year, which forces local councils to either increase council tax substantially or cut local services, and that's going to hit the poorest in our society the most.
Thanks, John. Let's go to Fiona Hislop to rebut
so I said this budget was about stability, but also to try and help those the poorest and to help the families in particular. In terms of the Scottish budget, the actual block grant itself is under severe pressure. And bearing in mind, 18 billion out of 40 billion of this budget is going on health. And in terms of local government, the additional funding that's going to local government are for key services, education, additional teachers, 3,500 teachers, and also to have an uplift on the social care wages. That's really important because they're the key areas. So it is about stability, and the vast majority of people will be in their position. It provides a stable income, which I think is really important in challenging times.
I understand that, and I understand your points about the other benefits of living in, and advantages both fiscally and in terms of society of living in Scotland. But do you accept arithmetically that the tax take from the people of Scotland is going to increase as a consequence of this budget? It can do no other, given that the higher bands are being frozen.
The Finance Secretary made quite clear in terms of setting out what the fiscal position would be. I think the challenges we've got is under COVID, we're expecting a 2% reduction in terms of, and that's the OBR stats in terms of what our income is likely to be, and also in relation to the Brexit impact, that's minus 4%. Now, what you've got to do, currently we're still living in the pandemic, is this is a budget for recovery, it's for tackling climate change and also tackling inequalities. So the Finance Secretary has steered, I think, a bold and ambitious programme, but also being quite pragmatic as well as being progressive.
Pam, do you think Fiona is up there saying it enhances equality, egalitarianism in Scottish society? Do you believe that to be the case?
No way. And to say that it's about social care workers getting an increase, 48 pence is an absolute disgrace. It's derisory. These people are the people who we stood outside on a Thursday night and clapped for. And I can tell you, as someone who relies on social care every single day of my life, they are worth far more than a 48% increase. It is unbelievable that was considered to be enough.
So, Pam, you also know that it went up to
I'm glad you've raised it. Let's go with that. The offer was additional money, a £10.50 base, wasn't it, for particularly for carers and for those in other areas that are characterised like that. Fiona Hislop, are you saying that that's an advantageous settlement? I mean,
can I say I think I know that we need to pay social care workers more. I think in terms of the pressures that are on our healthcare system, we know that is also because of social care pressures and people leaving the sector to go to other jobs. Now, remember, it was only in April 2021 that it went and was increased to £9.50. So over the year, that is a £1 increase from £9.50 to £10.50. Now, is that enough? I don't think it is enough. Do I want to see an increase? Of course I do. But it's the pace of change and how we can balance the budget to ensure that amount can be paid as we go. And I would like to see this as the first instalment of an increase on a regular basis. But the reality of budget in government is you've got to balance it. And if Pam and Duncan Glancy wants to raise income tax to pay for that, then the Labour Party should be putting forward that proposal. But I've not heard.
I like this as a topic. It's a big talking point. Let's go back to Pam and then let's bring in the other guests on this. Pam, on this point about the carers' pay.
I just think it's a disgrace. And even to say that in April 2021, they had the increase to that at that point, these people needed an increase in their salary for many, many, many years before the COVID pandemic hit. Then they turned up at shifts at day in, day out without correct PPE that they needed, put themselves at risk in order to make sure that people like me could live our lives. And to get a 48% increase is an utter insult. And on
So
the point about what would Scottish Labour do about it, well, we've already told you what we would do about it. We would use some of your £3.9 billion extra that you got to be able to pay for it. Being in government is about choices, Fiona. And actually what this budget shows is that the choices you make that do not protect people on the lowest income. You will not meet your child poverty targets. You're not going to address the absolute chaos in the recruitment crisis in social care and healthcare. It's going to do nothing to sort out the bed blocking crisis, and the NHS is going to be further under stress.
So I know that others have to come in, but
yes, please go on, Fiona, please.
The pay level in 2007 when we came into power was £5.35. The inflationary increase since that is that actual figure. It's round about the 48% that you talked about was the inflation since then. The increase this government has given is over 90%. So that trajectory of increasing progressively is what we've done. But there is not 3.9 billion extra. That money is having to shore up the core budget, and that's on health, and it's on teachers, and it's on the areas that we know for a COVID recovery are absolutely essential. But I'm conscious, Brian, I'll probably take up too much time.
No, you were quite right, because you got a direct attack. I'm quite happy to get that. Let's bring in Jamie Halker-Johnson on public sector pay, and then John Ferry. Jamie.
Well, I think what I would say with Pam is right. It's about priorities, and the SNP are always very good at talking about what their priorities are, and it's the ability to deliver on them, and they don't. And Fiona and others can dispute the 3.9 billion. That's what's happened. There's been an increase in the Scottish Government's funding. It's up by 3.9 billion, and it's for them to decide how they use it and how they use it sensibly, and to to deliver the priorities that they have. They then can't put their hands up and say, well, don't criticize us on our priorities. And
Jamie, the UK budget has increased, but the UK ministers have also the Treasury has also stripped out from the calculations the additional expenditure on COVID. Are you saying the expenditure on COVID is at an end? It doesn't seem to me as if it's at an end. We're about to have a statement from the First Minister about the increasing problem. So that cash has been stripped out, and yet is still having to be found by the Scottish Government. That's Kate Forbes.
Because, Brian, the situation is different to where it was last year. We don't have mass furlough. We don't have at this stage the support being provided for business that we were providing last year. That may well change, and we'll have to see what happens in the next few hours, and the next few weeks, and the next few months. But obviously, where there is additional spending by the UK government, there are consequentials for Scotland, and it's how those consequentials are used. Okay. And the problem is, what we have seen throughout the pandemic is a situation where consequentials come from Scotland and they're diverted onto SNP priorities rather than the priorities necessary for people. And impacts on local government spending impacts on the service they provide, and they provide those services to some of the most vulnerable people in our society.
Are you saying you would substantially increase public sector pay? That's not the evidence from the way the UK government behaves in precisely that sector.
No, what I'm saying is that it's for the SNP as the government in Scotland to determine what their priorities are and how they fund them from the budget they receive and the taxes that they're able to raise. What they talk about is how they're constrained. They're not constrained. They're constrained by the ambitions. They're constrained by what decisions they're able to make. But what they're always able to do is blame somebody else.
By the budget, surely they are. They're constrained by cash.
Well, 3.9 billion extra, Brian, and as I say, what we're seeing is cuts in large areas and focus on others. The budget for some of the overseas work, which is actually a lot of it reserved, has gone up. It's around about, I think, 30 odd million at the moment. We've seen the Constitution budget go up by 21 million, and there are other areas as well. And this is the problem. They kind of wave around this. We don't have enough money when we know that there are areas where they're focusing, taxpayers' money that we would all agree that shouldn't be doing, and certainly shouldn't be a priority when we are in tougher times.
John Ferry, on public sector pay, the Liberal Democrats have said that teachers and nurses, etc., will be left short in real terms.
Yeah, so many teachers and nurses who are in that above 25,000 pay bracket who aren't going to be rich. If you're earning £26,000 a year, you're a nurse, you're a single parent with one or two children, yeah, you might get an extra £10 or £20 a week in benefits for them, but you're going to face a big pay cut as well as higher council tax, and you're going to be a lot worse off. So it's an interesting budget, and that this is potentially the first one that we've seen from the SNP that actually hurts the lower middle classes, you could say, and that could have political implications for them later. Just going back to some of the points you raised there, the COVID spending, ongoing COVID spending, there is obviously ongoing COVID spending that's coming through from the UK government. It's wrapped up in health budgets and other things. And if you look in England, the government there has managed to fund a line of long COVID clinics right across England. I think there's more than 70 now. They've even managed to fund child-specific long COVID clinics. We've seen none of that in Scotland. So they're managing to find money for things like that in England, but the Scottish government here somehow can't do that.
You mentioned there the budget, the support for children. The finance secretary made a huge point about the money for children, the doubling of the child payment to £20 a week, a Scottish welfare fund, other measures to assist them for the slightly older, free bus travel for young people starting in January. She described it as the most comprehensive package of support for children and young people that these islands have ever seen. Would you accept that, John?
No, I wouldn't characterise it like that at all. I think this time next year, when we look at a 26, 27-year-old single parent nurse with 2 kids who's earning £27,000, they're going to be far worse off than they are now.
Duncan Glancy, what about the package of support for children and young people?
So I think I said earlier about the £20 child payment. Obviously, doubling the child payment to £20 is welcome. However, it is not going to meet our child poverty targets. And those targets were targets that were set unanimously by Parliament before the COVID pandemic hit, before there was any notion of a £20 increase to universal credit, which, by the way, should have stayed, without caveat. And so we need to meet them regardless of what's going on. And the Fraser of Allender Institute have published research that shows that unless we put the child payment up to £40 per week by April 2023, we're not going to meet it. And yesterday, Kate Forbes, when I asked her about that, the Finance Secretary said there are other measures in our budget that will help. And of course, some of those other measures will help in the long term. But what's been absolutely clear...
To be fair to Kate Forbes, it was a pretty long list that she was giving of measures to try and support children and young people.
And yeah, we've got a pretty long list of young people and children living in poverty in Scotland, so it kind of is proportionate. But what the problem is all of those things will take a long time to see through and to become the money in people's pockets. And actually, what the Fraser of Allender Institute, Joseph Rowntree Foundation, Poverty Alliance, and others have all told us is that if you want to meet those targets, which we must, not just because they're targets that Parliament set, but because every single child living in poverty is a tragedy and we need to sort that. But if we want to meet them, we can't expect the investments in childcare or changes to wages. And in fact, the other thing is, if you're going to really change child poverty targets, you need to look at how you're going to increase pay for women who overwhelmingly are represented in the care sector, who are now only getting 48 an hour more. So if you want to do all of those things, they take much longer in the long term to do. So what they've said is, in the short term, Social Security needs to do the heavy lifting, and that was what the Social Security Committee put in the letter to the government as well, and that was ignored.
Let's bring in Jamie and then Fiona. I'm going to move in a second to health and then to the broad economy, but let's stick just briefly to this issue of the support package that was really a lot of stress on that from the Finance Secretary for children and young people. Jamie Halker-Johnson and then Fiona on that point.
Yeah, well, we supported the £20 additional. I think that was the right thing to do. But the pressure on services that are delivered that support children and young people is there through the pressure being put onto a lot of local councils. We're going to see a strain on their budgets, strain on their services over the next few years, because they're either going to have to raise taxes considerably, or they're going to have to cut services. And we've seen that already over the last few years. And for a lot of councils, there simply isn't any kind of fat basically to be trimmed off there. We've not got onto education yet, but obviously that's a vital area.
Well, bring that in as part of the children and young people thing. Right. Have a go. Yeah, go.
Okay,
for it.
Well, I was part of our education team for a number of years, for a number of months, particularly through the pandemic. We've seen huge issues faced by young people, particularly from some of the more from the worse off families who weren't able to access online education. We've seen a number of children missing out on education entirely during the pandemic because they didn't have the technology. They weren't able to be checked. There was huge pressure on teachers. Time and time again, I asked the Scottish Government, time and time again, when are you going to get support? What access do people have to digital learning? How are we going to make sure that the worse off there? And we just got prevarication, we got dismissal, we got deflection, all the way through.
It was a global pandemic. It was hardly ordinary circumstances.
That's fine. Be honest about it. If you're not going to be able to deliver, laptops or devices, if you're not going to, if you recognise there's a problem out there, the fact is the Scottish Government weren't even asking. They were laying the responsibility on councils. So we're already trying to deliver a huge range of additional services and support to people across the country. And actually, what we wanted was an honest answer. We didn't get an answer from them. And that was an absolute nightmare. The point is that we've now got to make sure that those young people, as I say, particularly from some of the worst off backgrounds, who have missed out on, a huge part of their education and been left behind, are supported through. And, we know that we've had an education system under great pressure over the last few years, particularly, even before the pandemic. And I see nothing that's going to improve that from this budget.
Fiona Hislop, there's a package of measures for children and young people, but Jamie Halker-Johnson is saying there that they're starting in a slump, they're starting in a trough, they're starting in appropriate positions.
This is the biggest package to support young people than I can recall in my 20 years in government, in Parliament since 1999. And if you want to tackle poverty, you've got to tackle family poverty and you've got to tackle child poverty. And it does take time to try and relieve that. That is why the extension of early year learning and childcare is so important. That does help women particularly, because it helps them have more secure jobs and have for longer hours. The increase in free school meals. I was the minister that introduced the pilot of free school meals because I knew how important it was, not just for poverty related issues, but also health. That's getting extended for you up to P5 and beyond. And then you've also got the transport issue and also the cost of education, and indeed the increase in funding for digital devices and the increase in teachers.
What about Jamie's point? What about Jamie's point that educational provision is already lagging, is already struggling, is already in the doldrums, partly because of the pandemic?
So the pandemic is still with us, and that's what my question was in the budget yesterday. Is people want things that are really important to them, and they would be really important in a non-pandemic situation. But we are in a pandemic, and that is why the focus on additional teachers, additional resource for education, and additional resources in health is the main focus of what the budget is about. We're trying to give a trajectory, yes, but a lot of it is dealing with the here and now, and that means that the pressures I've got. My daughter's a teacher. I know the pressures they're under, and I know that the progress they've made over the last year. I've got a son that had to do his hires last year. I know exactly the pressures that our teachers in our schools are under. But in terms of that provision, the digital provision is there, and I actually think we should also not just thank the social care workers for getting through this. Remember the pressure on teachers, and they're still having to deal with that. And who knows? And I'm hopeful that we will have 2022 in a better and more stable way for our education health service. But you've got resources
hang on a second, Jay. You must have had some year of it living in a household where your son was sitting his hires. That must have been.
Well, especially when I was running the government and I had my year of the economy brief during the pandemic, and as my colleagues we were fighting election while he was having to do his assessment. So I think he managed pretty well.
Did he do okay? Yeah.
Talking about him, so I better stop.
He doesn't. Jamie, you were keen to get back in.
Yeah, he won't welcome you talking about him, Fiona.
It wasn't his mum. It was me. Blame me.
Yeah, blame Brian Taylor. There's the
easy hit.
I mean, look, the number of absolutely agree. The pressure that teachers were under, and actually just families were under, being able to deliver this. But there were families trying to deliver education for 3 children on one tablet or one computer. And when we were asking questions on that, the Scottish Government were including that as they have access to digital services. I mean, it was just nonsense, because because they weren't asking essentially councils or schools to ask parents and households exactly what they had access to. And we can't keep, blaming, 14 years of educational pressure on the COVID pandemic. This has been going on for a very, very long time. And, we need the government to be honest about it and recognize that there is a problem and make sure that problem's addressed. But we've not seen that. And now we're seeing this COVID pandemic being blamed for problems that were well before it.
I'm going to move to health, and then I want to finish with the plenty time yet, but I want to finish with the broad economy.
Could I just come back in on the education?
Yeah.
Very, very briefly. The there are huge cuts to people attainment funds, and one of the issues that's going to mean is that a number of our poorest children are not going to be able to get supported in the way that they need. So to say that actually this budget is supporting children and young people in that way is again not fair or not true. And also, I'm sure Fiona, that you were in Parliament the other day when the EIS stood outside Parliament saying that the pay offer for teachers and that the additional stresses that they've been under is just not good enough. And we've seen also that the STUC have come out and said that the pay offer for all public sector workers is not good enough either. So I honestly really fear that we're not in a position where what we're offering for children and young people is enough. There's no extra money on ventilation in schools. There's no money to support the poorest schools in our society to make sure that children get tutored, and there's not enough in there to look at an evaluation of how we've actually treated education during the pandemic. All of these things are going to be essential if we're actually going to have a proper education recovery.
There was a £200 million increase in the pupil attainment fund, which means that poor people and poor families right across Scotland, and indeed my constituency, who wouldn't have had it previously, will also get that.
But that's because those who wouldn't have had it previously because they weren't living in the areas that needed the most. So what's happening? You tell that to the communities in Blackburn and Armadale constituency. And well, you tell the people in Rutherglen who are going to lose thousands and thousands and thousands of pounds of funding for all the pupils that are getting to miss out because the pupil attainment fund there. So actually,
across the country is
that is a classic case of more money spread thinner. That's a classic case of that, and it doesn't do anything to help our poorest children in our poorest schools.
Let's move to thank you very much for that contribution as well, but let's move to health service. Let's bring in John Ferry. John, the Liberal Democrats, it's £18 billion, 18,000 million pounds of expenditure upon the health service, including extra money for mental health after a campaign that was very largely led by Willie Rennie and now by Alex Cole-Hamilton in Parliament alongside the campaign elsewhere. I know you'll say it's never quite enough, but surely that is a substantial response by the Finance Secretary. Yeah,
so obviously bearing in mind that a lot of the additional health money has come through from health spending from the UK government, and it had to go into health. So it was unavoidable that it would have a big increase in the health budget. It's obviously absolutely needed. We've definitely seen some progress on mental health spending.
Well, let me correct you there. It wasn't unavoidable. She could have spent that $1 billion on anything she liked, but she announced that she was going to pass on all of the consequentials, every single penny, to funding on health service, social care, and within the health service on mental health in particular, seeking to make it 10% of the budget eventually.
Yep. So that's seeking to make it 10% of the budget. I mean, when you've got kids waiting over a year for a referral to mental health services, obviously that needs to go up quite quickly. That investment. I mentioned long COVID clinics earlier in the discussion, and this is something that I think it's an important point where we're really behind in Scotland. They've got a multitude of a string of specialised long COVID clinics across England, which have been funded from the NHS England budget. We've not seen anything like that in Scotland. They've got specialist ones particularly focused on children there. We're not seeing that in Scotland. So obviously the increased health spending is welcome. It's definitely needed. And that's really the legacy of COVID that we're going to see for years to come. But when we're not spending in these sorts of areas, that's going to put more pressure on GPs. It's going to put more pressure on A&E, and the kind of vicious spiral that the health service in Scotland is under just now will only get worse, I think.
Jamie Halker-Johnson, then Fiona. Jamie.
Thanks very much. I'd agree with what John's saying there. My understanding was the figure was closer to 2 billion, but it is vital, and there has been that increase, and that is to be welcomed. There are still major issues around recruitment within the NHS. I'm sure I saw something yesterday from Shetland NHS saying that they're short of, I think, I was going to say, please don't quote me on this, but I'm going to quote it, and I'm pretty sure it was around about 30 nurse vacancies short. There are real pressures on our ambulance service. I had a members debate on that issue. Good to see investment in CAMS, because that's been an issue for a very, very long time. There's been huge pressure, particularly on young people throughout the pandemic, because they've not had those normal ways of dealing with some of the stress and pressures of life. I was disappointed to see real terms cut in some of the addiction services, the drug and alcohol side of it, because we know what an issue that is. Nobody needs to be told the problems that Scotland has with drugs deaths. So I think that's a real area of concern. But there is some good news around the health side, just not enough. And there are still some really big fundamental issues.
Fiona, and then Pam. Fiona.
So, I mean, Jamie will know there's already been a substantial increase in the drugs and alcohol service, much needed over this last year. So I think the point is that there's an uplift has happened this year.
Okay.
But in terms of the issue around health, I remember when health used to be about 30% of the Scottish budget. It's now nearing 50%, not least because of the additional funding that is required because of COVID. We've got record numbers of people in the health service and in terms of consultants, nurses, etc. But the real pressure, I think that's why an important foundation for the National Care Service is the investment that is going into that area, because we know even as of today, the pressures that are facing our A&E, for example, much of that is because of the issues, particularly I know because I've spoken to NHS Lothian just last week about it, was the issues around social care, particularly not necessarily in West Lothian where I am, but in Edinburgh. And that again comes back to the pressures on the care service. So that integration of health and care, that journey that we're on needs strong foundations of funding. And that's what this budget has secured.
Pam Duncan Glancy on health. Briefly, Jamie, if you want. Yeah, go on, Jamie.
No, and sorry, Pam, I will be brief. I can agree with Fiona on that. I think there's undoubtedly some issues, in terms of it is good to see better interrelations between the two. Whether there is enough on the preventative side within this budget on the health side, really remains to be seen.
Pam Duncan Glancy on health, please.
Thank you for that. And this is where Fiona and I and others will agree that we cannot address the crisis in the NHS without addressing the crisis in social care. And yesterday I met with Kevin Stewart, the Minister for Social Care, as you know, and two unpaid carers to talk to him about the severe risk to unpaid carers right now. And there's many of them who, some are missing cancer appointments because they can't get the social care to cover when they're not in to care for their loved ones. That's the sort of situation that social care is in, which is why I'm so angry about the really, really low increase in social care wages, because we're not going to increase more. We're not going to get people into the sector if we don't offer proper paying conditions, safety at work, and make it look like an attractive opportunity. And we're not going to do that if we continue to pay them well below what they deserve. And in actual fact, we've seen, you mentioned Lothian there, Fiona, we've seen that health boards in that area, and in fact across the country, to be honest, are now asking families to say, as an unpaid carer, can you help us discharge your loved one from hospital? I mean, the notion that the NHS isn't overwhelmed is unbelievable. We've got the army in because ambulance waiting times are too long. We've got the Red Cross in. We're asking second year students to come in and meet the gap in the NHS, all because the gap in the NHS in terms of recruitment was there long before COVID. So not only has COVID come along and made it very, very difficult, but at the start of this pandemic, the NHS was fighting for its life, and now it's fighting for our life in the middle of a pandemic, and that's due to the gross underfunding and under-resourcing. And 1,300 beds have been lost since 2011 in the health service. So you have to remember it into the crisis, in crisis.
Fiona, a brief response to that, and then I'm going to move to the broader context.
So everybody knows that in terms of trying to transfer from acute services into primary services, Jamie talked about preventive health, that point about putting resources there. Some procedures don't mean you have to stay in. You can do things on outpatients. So I think we need to separate out the beds issue in relation to what the current situation is in relation to care. But I think we all agree that the health service and the care service is so integrated, and that pressure has been exacerbated by the pandemic, but it still needs systemic change, and that's why we're having the National Care Service.
Yeah, I'm going to draw you to close on that one. I'm going to give us about 7 or 8 minutes or so, not really very much time, but here it's been a very, very good discussion thus far. I want to talk about the broad economic strategy. There's a medium-term financial strategy published to accompany the budget. It talks about meeting climate targets. It talks about restoring the natural environment, stimulating innovation. It talks about a well-being economy. I'm not sure that's been clearly defined as yet by the Scottish Government. So you're talking about transforming, Fiona, Kate Forbes talking about transforming the nature of the economy with 2 billion extra of what she called low-carbon investment in infrastructure. It's about changing the nature of the economy. Jamie Harker-Johnson, is that a sensible ambition? And have we got a sufficient detail or even a strategic vision from the Scottish Government with regard to the broad economy and particularly in tackling climate change?
Well, I think this is one of those areas where those words sound very nice, but whether they'll deliver and what's intended, if we actually kind of knew what was being intended anyway. And I think there's some sort of sense of lack of consistency there. I mean, firstly, of course, we need to respond not to necessarily the economy of today, but the economy of tomorrow. And there are going to be real opportunities through the green sector and increased greening of our economy. We are, as a country, and certainly as in a region, and my region particularly, the Highlands and Islands, doing a huge amount of work in terms of the renewables side, and there's lots of opportunities there. But we have to recognise where we are too, and there are key sectors and key parts of our economy that are not supported and weren't mentioned yesterday. One of the real issues that I had in terms of particularly my region was around infrastructure. We are now seeing uncertainty over long promised dualling projects on the A9 and the A96. These are vital for the local communities that I represent for a whole host of reasons. And we're now getting a real lack of clarity, which is leading to a real lack of certainty on it. We've seen the changes around on Cambo. Now, I probably stand alone on believing or appreciating that Cambo, and my thinking needs to go ahead, because we've got a choice. We can either close it down, lose all the jobs, but still then have to import from abroad, or we can maintain it, keep the jobs, and use it as part of the changing of our economy, which will be happening anyway. We know that there's going to be there are changes in our North Sea economy, and they are being supported by the UK government. But this is where there's a lack of consistency, because we saw the SNP saying at one point that it should go ahead and it was going to be the basis on an independent future. Then there should be a review, and now coming out against it. There are a lot of people in my region, the Highlands and Islands, and particularly in the northeast as well, that see their jobs being threatened. And some of the language from the Scottish government, from ministers, calling those who support the oil industry hard right, is utterly, utterly disgraceful. And it won't be forgotten by those people who work within the sector.
Fiona, this is a practical point. Kate Forbes, the Finance Secretary, talked about a well-being economy. Again, I heard the First Minister's lecture on this about 18 months ago. I'm still not entirely certain what that means, but she says it's enterprising but focused on the environment as well. But how do you do that when you're in partnership with a party, the Greens, who don't actually rate GDP growth as being a significant measure at all? Isn't Jamie Halker-Johnson right there? The focus is likely to be upon a different sort of economy, but the sort of economy that perhaps we wouldn't welcome, certainly in the Northeast or in Shetland.
So the government agreement between the SNP and the Greens had exceptions, and as Jamie well knows, oil and gas is one of those exceptions. But in terms of the budget and in terms of the medium-term strategy and looking ahead, actually the capital infrastructure choices that have been made with that $2 billion to help deliver net zero, it probably has not got the attention it deserves, and probably not in the time that we've got left. But
I thought it was hugely significant.
It's huge. Now that also came out. When I was in government, I'm now a backbencher, I was instrumental in the development of the infrastructure investment plan, which had that in it already in terms of February, and looking at the forward look as to what was required. Now that will also bring jobs with it. We've already seen that with the Green Jobs Fund that was established, 850 announced today, the big MIG announcement, and £2 billion actually in terms of what will be needed is a small amount. But remember, in terms of the private capital, we know will be available.
The private sector,
During COP26, we heard from Mark Carney as well that there's this wall of green capital in terms of the private investment, which globally will run into trillions. And how do we make sure that we harness that, make sure that we're developing just transition with oil and gas companies will be absolutely vital as part of that transition, and to make sure that we protect jobs and investment. And we need to make sure we've got the good projects like NIG that can harness, some government investment, but also that huge amount of private investment, because that's the sea change that we'll have with our renewables.
Brian, can I come in for the last minute?
Yeah, please go on. Yeah, go on.
I was going to say, we do, when it comes to the economy generally, and also the green economy, we do tend to get far more platitudes from our government rather and vague aims rather than anything concrete. But there's a really important thing that came out of yesterday's budget, which has been little talked about so far, which is that the devolution of income tax so far is actually looking as if it's going to be negative in terms of Scotland's budget in the 2020s. So even though our income taxes have gone up by 500 odd million pounds, that's only expected to raise about £6 million, I think, in the coming year, and then go negative in coming years. And that's
Because
an incredible.
Yeah.
You think, but that's an incredible a reflection of SNP mismanagement of our economy. They're de-stimulating our economy.
Or of the fiscal framework that was negotiated with the Treasury, which they're now trying to renegotiate. And Kate Forbes said there'd have to be changes to the parameters upon which that was based.
Yeah, and of course, when things go wrong, the excuse is normally we don't have enough powers to do things properly. But really, they have enough power now to stimulate our economy, to not spend hundreds of millions of pounds on ferries that aren't going to take to sea, and these sorts of things. I think spending per head in Scotland is about 20% more than other parts of the UK. So we should be a much more dynamic economy.
We're going to go over a little bit.
John, Brexit and COVID have reduced the projections that affect income tax, and I said that at the beginning.
These are decisions your government made, Fiona, knowing the implications, and this is the problem. You can't kind of roll back from decisions that SNP ministers have made that have taken money out of the Scottish economy.
Pam Duncan Glancy, what do you make of the vision of the Scottish economy? Do you buy it? Do you endorse it?
I think it's hugely lacking. I think our high streets are being left untouched. I think the cost of living crisis has not been supported in the way that it should be. That's why we would have put £50 voucher scheme in place so that people could spend money in the local economy. We'd have had the 50% rates reduction for retail and hospitality, and why we would have looked at a proper social security package to make sure that everyone has enough money to live on, and none of that came across in the budget.
Fiona, has that final word?
So in terms of what we have to do, we've got to marry the here and now, and that includes support for our local high streets. But actually, our job and the job we have to do is to steer a future that is not just for the next year, it's for the next 5 years, 10 years. And if we're serious about meeting net zero, we have to change the nature of our economy and our society. We're far more interdependent as it is, and well-being means measuring a whole variety of different things, not just simply GDP, and steering a course as to what's important. And that net zero drive you'll see increasingly important in both policy but also the economic strategy.
I get that, but I'm going to be keeping nipping away at the ears on this one as to what exactly well-being means and how you measure those other factors other than GDP. But I'll have to do that in the new year, because that's the end of my final podcast for this season. Many thanks to the guests. Thank you very, very much indeed. Many thanks to all of you watching, listening, whatever one does at home. You're getting the thing along the bottom there about the subscription. Give a Herald subscription to your loved one for Christmas and watch their faces light up. No, seriously, give a Herald subscription to your loved ones for Christmas. It's an excellent idea. From me, Brian Taylor, to the New.